They thought I couldn't hear them. I was standing just inside the kitchen doorway, the kettle hissing on the stove, when Michael and Patricia lowered their voices and started to talk like I was already an audience of one who had nothing to do with the conversation. "We should move her to a safe facility," I heard Patricia murmur, soft as moth wings. Michael nodded. They sounded practiced, like people who'd rehearsed compassion until it felt like a chore. They called it a safe facility. I called my lawyer. "I'm Charlotte Hayes. I lived in the same brick bungalow in a sleepy Cleveland neighborhood for 46 years. Frank and I planted the rose bushes, painted the porch, argued about whether the attic should ever be used for anything other than storage. Frank died 6 years ago, and the house kept me, its little creaks, the light in the kitchen in the late afternoon, the backyard where the neighbor's maple dropped red leaves into my snow. It was more than wood and glass. It was our life." Michael grew up here. He came by at least once a week after Dad passed, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes bringing news. Patricia moved in 3 years ago. At first she was kind. She baked, she brought magazines. That kindness was the beginning of the story. The rest looked like kindness, smelled like care, but slowly it started to taste different. When I heard them that afternoon, everything slowed. The kettle boiled. The house felt too small for the things I needed to hold. The sound of their whispering, a brochure folded like a sacred text in Michael's hand, the imaginary signatures they had been planning. They were talking about me in the way two people talk about an object, something to be moved, a problem to be solved, not about a mother. I sat down at the kitchen table with my tea gone cold and tried to be a reasonable person. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, I told myself. Maybe they were worried and speaking without thinking. Maybe Patricia had picked up a brochure at some event and Michael wanted his mother to be safe. The human thing is to want to believe the best. I'm a woman who'd folded 1,000 towels and taught Sunday school and lent out casseroles until my pots gathered dust. Hope came quickly, but a small, stubborn suspicion tugged like a threat I couldn't ignore. That night, I opened the bottom drawer where I kept the papers Frank and I had deemed essential. Deeds, insurance policies, the pearl-buttoned album of our wedding photographs. I went through them with the patience that comes from years of sorting socks and sorting grief. I found what I expected, and then a page I hadn't expected. A letter, neatly typed, outlining a care plan and signed in my name. A power of attorney document folded in a way I didn't recall folding. I had signed things before. Checks, permission slips for Michael when he was a kid. Maybe a line on a hospital form when Frank went into surgery. But this piece of paper felt different.
It granted someone the right to act in my stead. It named Michael. My hands went ice cold. I read the lines again and again. My signature was there. I remembered signing a thing at the bank months earlier. Some new ATM card they said I needed. A small form. A woman at the counter who smiled too brightly. Had I been tricked? Had my memory failed me in a way that made me sign away my home before I knew it? Or had someone taken advantage when I trusted them most? I didn't sleep. I didn't need to. When the house whispered at night, I listened, and I wondered what Frank would have said. I began at dawn the way you begin with a stubborn weed. I dug. The first call was to the bank. My voice shook, which I hated. "Hi, this is Charlotte Hayes," I said, trying to make my voice sound like it had settled. "I'd like to review my account history." The young man on the other end, Tom, I think, sounded like he handled this kind of thing all the time. He didn't say the worst words first. He was gentle and bureaucratic. "We can do that, Miss Hayes. I can go over recent activity with you now. Are you currently at home?" I told him yes. He asked me to confirm several small transactions, and then, in a voice careful enough to be pained, he read me a list that felt like someone turning a page on my life. Transfers to an account in Michael's name, a couple of checks made out to a facility I had never heard of, several withdrawals that left a hole the size of a winter in a bank balance meant for repairs and groceries. "These transfers, were they authorized by you?" Tom asked. "No," I heard myself reply. I had to say it twice to believe it. No, I did not authorize them. When the bank mailed me the copies, my stomach dropped. There were signatures, my name, scrawled in ink on a line, on forms opening accounts and allowing transfers. There were notes in handwriting I sometimes recognized, Michael's cramped looped M curling at the top of the pages. They had been careful. They had made it look like assistance. They had drafted a narrative where I needed help, and they were being my heroes. When I confronted Michael about it later, when I had my proof and my voice had steadied, he said, "Mom, you signed." He looked at me with a look that asked forgiveness preemptively, like he had rehearsed with austere of regret. But I remember things. I remember the long afternoon when a woman at the bank handed me a form and I signed because it was there, because I trusted Michael, because he hovered and smiled in that way sons do when they want to be helpful. I remember laughter at dinner, the way Frank used to smack his pocket to find his handkerchief. Memory held me like a compass. I called Doris the next day. Doris and I had been friends since our children were small enough to fall asleep in car seats and leave Cheerios behind them like secular confetti. Doris is practical and blunt and not easily shocked.
Her voice broke into laughter when I told her about the brochure in the kitchen. Then she stopped laughing and said, "You need an attorney. Not a friend of a friend attorney, someone who knows the language they use when they take advantage of people." She gave me a name, Bernard Morrison. "He's the sort who grew up reading legal pads for pleasure," she said, which made me laugh despite everything. She promised she'd come with me to the first meeting. Meeting Bernard felt like walking into sunlight after a week of storm. He sat across from me in an office lined with books and case files, polite but not sentimental. He didn't gasp when I told him about the transfers. He didn't say, "Oh dear." He said a term that sounded like a verdict in small-town courtrooms and in TV dramas alike: financial exploitation. "You're not imagining this, Charlotte," Bernard said, leaning forward. He spoke in plain sentences that felt like hands opening a locked door. "What you have is a set of actions that, when put together, show that you were transitioned from being a decision-maker to being a subject of control. There's the POA, or the paperwork in your name, unauthorized transfers, changes in access. Those are the elements of exploitation." It felt good and bad to hear it named. Good because naming something puts a light on it. Bad because the light revealed the full ugliness of what I thought was care. Bernard explained options. He did it like a man who'd seen people stand on either side of the same fork. Some choose to put on rubber gloves and fight in public. Others choose a quieter route, move the pieces, and close the book without a spectacle. He told me a courtroom would be long and expensive. He told me a younger son could be spiteful, and family battles could splinter and leave the person in need lonelier than before. He said he could move to revoke the POA, file for an injunction, pursue restitution. He also, as a practical matter that didn't involve blood in the streets, described a path where we reclaimed assets and moved her to safety on her own terms. I remember nodding at his words like a student taking notes. All the while, I felt a small fire kindling that did not want to be quenched. "I don't want to make myself a spectacle," I told him, "but I don't want to disappear into something they've planned like a surprise I never asked for." "We can do both," Bernard said. "We can document your competence, we can approach banks with the documentation, we can demand an accounting, and, if you choose, we can also plan a discreet wind-down of certain assets, so you're not stuck in a place you don't want to be while a messy legal process unfolds." He used the word discreet. It sounded nicer than secret, but both are siblings. He talked about documentation, doctor's letters, financial statements, witnesses, things to show I wasn't confused or incompetent, that I could make decisions for myself. That was the beginning. The doctor.
Rachel Chen was a young physician with a calm voice and a no-nonsense manner. She came to my kitchen table and sat with me as we drank coffee that tasted like old days. She asked me about my medications, my daily life, my memory. She asked me to name 3 presidents and to recall a story about my childhood. She watched me as I recounted the time Frank tried to fix the garden faucet with chewing gum and how I had scolded him for watching soap operas at noon. She watched me as I remembered every trial of paint we had used on the porch. When she was done, she wrote a letter that felt like armor, a physician's note that said I was competent to make my own decisions and that, as of the date of evaluation, I was of sound mind. Holding that letter in my hands did not make me invincible, but it made me visible in a box of evidence. It was a hammer against the gaslights. It meant that if the sun tried to say I was incapable of thinking for myself, there was a neutral, professional voice that said otherwise. The more paper I collected, the angrier I became. Anger is an odd companion. It can sit like a steady ember that warms you, or like a wildfire that consumes. I kept it warm and useful. I made a list of what's missing, and next to it a list of things I wanted back. My access to the bank account, my home untouched, my late husband's memory not monetized. Bernard started the process of asking for an accounting from the bank. He wrote letters that had a sound like a lock snapping shut. He warned me that institutions often delayed, that they might be sympathetic but slow. that he could push and prod and use their procedures against them. And while he did that, we had to decide what I would do if the Banks and Michael and Patricia continued to move like people who felt entitled to act on their own timetable. Doris came over with a casserole and a small, practical fury. "You know what you need to do?" she said, spooning food into a dish. "You need to choose yourself." Choosing myself felt like a luxury and a duty. My default had always been to keep the peace. I'd saved my first check for Frank's suit pockets. I was good at small mercies. But I was 73, and the thought of being moved like a pawn in a well-intentioned robbery made me bristle. I also understood the cost of a public fight. Years in court, families torn, the neighbors' whispers changing my porch into a theater. So Bernard and I planned a path that we both agreed would be lawful and careful. We would collect evidence of the transfers and the POA's misuse. We would ask the bank to freeze access where appropriate. We would get the doctor's statement into file. And we would quietly explore the possibility of an out-of-the-spotlight sale of the house, so if push came to shove, I could leave on my terms. That was the turning point. It felt like standing at the edge of a dock with a suitcase in one hand and a map I hadn't drawn in the other.
The plan had a smell, paperwork and packing tape, the tinny sweetness of relief, and underneath it the sour tang of loss. To sell the house meant to give up its physical hold, but it also meant to take back control over my life. Susan Park was the realtor Bernard recommended. She had sold houses for people who needed quiet transactions, widowed professors, public figures, and, apparently, stubborn mothers who refused to be bought off. Her office smelled faintly of lemon. She brought with her a folder of similar stories and a calm competence that felt almost like a promise. "Discretion," she said when I told her what I wanted. "I can arrange private showings, cash offers, limited exposure. We make it appear like a normal sale. You continue living here until the closing day. We'll handle the details." Susan's voice had a rhythm I trusted. She understood that for me, the house was not a commodity to be flipped, but a memory to be stewarded until the moment I chose to let go. We spoke about donations of furniture to the church, about packing a few suitcases and sending boxes in the night. "Keep what you need," she said. "Leave what you don't." There was one more detail I hadn't known was there until the boxes were pulled back. Tucked inside a shoebox beneath the old winter sweaters, wrapped in a waxed envelope, was a small ledger Frank had kept. He had been secretive about saving for a rainy day, an old habit from his childhood, and he'd left a modest emergency fund for just-in-case situations with strict handwriting, for Charlotte if the wind gets rough. It wasn't a fortune. It was enough for a down payment and a few flights. It was enough to stir something in me that had been dormant, the idea that I could pick up and go. I remember the brochure like a tiny, bright lighthouse. It was glossy, full of photos of cabanas and candlelit decks, and a smiling couple on a balcony watching the last light of day. World cruise, 120 days of ports, it declared. I didn't know why the idea of the ocean made my chest unclench, but it did. The sea felt like a large, honest thing that had no interest in playing family politics. It simply existed, open and true. Booking the cruise wasn't an act of escaping recklessly. It was a carefully measured step, the sort of move Bernard called strategic withdrawal. We discussed how a prolonged trip would make it harder for Michael and Patricia to exercise day-to-day control. It would give me distance. It would also give me time. Time to let things settle. Time to meet new people. Time to breathe without watching over my shoulder every hour. It was both a refuge and a statement. I'm choosing life on my own terms. There were practical wrinkles. Getting the house sold required a buyer. Susan found one who offered cash and a promise of a quick closing. We asked for the closing to be staggered so I could remain until I chose to leave. We arranged to have the checks routed in secure ways Bernard approved. We told very few people. The fewer folks who knew, the fewer hands that could reach. But secrecy requires theater. I created an appearance. I started to behave in ways that would suggest acceptance. I made small comments about the brochure when Michael came over, the way a person in a play drops hints to set the scene. I smiled at Patricia's offers of help. I said the words they wanted to hear, in the softest voice I owned. Maybe I should see what they have, I said casually one evening at dinner, folding a napkin between my fingers. Maybe it would be peaceful. They exhaled relief like a couple who had persuaded themselves they had done the humane thing. Their shoulders dropped. Patricia kissed my cheek. Michael offered to help me with any details. I could see the weight lift from their faces.
It felt like watching a magician do a trick that only I knew the secret to. But I had not been idle. Behind my small performances, boxes had been silently filled with the essentials: sensible shoes, a cardigan that had always made me feel like myself, the photo of Frank. I made lists and labeled things in my mind. Susan arranged for private showings so strangers walked through my rooms like ordinary buyers and whispered politely about crown molding in the garden. The strangers' voices were bland and ordinary, the kind of voice that sells houses rather than steals them. As the day of the private showing came closer, I began to feel both traitor and liberator, two halves that had to be reconciled. I thought of Frank's hands, stained from years of gardening and building, and I thought of the life that had once been built in this house. Selling it was a severing, but also an honoring if I did it on my terms. I wanted to make sure that when the house left my address, it didn't leave me without dignity. On the night before a planned showing, Patricia sat beside me in the living room with her hands folded over her knees. "You'll be safe," she said, voice dipped in the syrup of concern. "Safe from what?" I asked. The question wasn't cruel. It was a measuring of the truth. Patricia shifted, a little annoyed. "From not knowing what's happening to you, from being alone, from accidents. We're thinking of you." I looked at her. My mouth wanted to say 1,000 things. The nights I had waited up for Michael when he got home late, the times I'd warmed his supper when he forgot, the loan I had given him once so he could finish school. Family is a complicated ledger. There are credits and debits, and often more of one than the other. I had loved him enough to make mistakes. I had tried to keep peace. Instead, I said, "I appreciate your worry." Then I added with a quiet steadiness, "But I'll make that decision when I'm ready." After she left, I carried a small notebook into the bedroom and added a line. The line was utility and will. Close sale, book cruise, return as needed, arrange attorney to file for accounting, keep letter from Dr. Ten at my side.
That night, I slept weirdly, the kind of sleep where you dream in fragments. Frank whistling while mowing the lawn, the kettle beginning to boil and then being still, a brochure with waves on it, the sound of applause I couldn't place. In the morning, the house smelled like the laundry I'd left. The sun found the brass on the banister. I moved through my rituals, the brushing of hair, the careful folding of the last clean towel, and felt like someone stepping into a costume and playing a part for a dear audience, the audience of my own future. Bernard had set a window for the bank to produce records. The bank took its time, as banks do. We asked for an explanation of the transfers. We asked Michael for an account of his actions, and was told essentially that I had signed everything and that he had handled what he thought was best. He said the words "for your own good" more than once, like a litany. On the day the potential buyer came through, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat on the back steps. The maple was beginning to show color at the edges. The buyer and Susan wandered through my rooms, their shoes making light notes across the hardwood. They admired the chandelier in the dining room. They asked about the roof. I watched them like someone reading a play they'd written long ago. When the buyer left and the house closed for the day, Susan came out to the steps with a small envelope. "We're in pretty good shape," she said, smiling. "They're serious. Cash offer. Quick closing." She handed me the paper. It was short and bright with possibility. A part of me mourned with the low, slow sorrow of someone watching a pet leave for an unfamiliar life. Another part, fiercer and lighter, felt like a bird that had been cooped too long being handed a key. I sat with both feelings and let them coexist. Grief is not a villain to be vanquished. Sometimes grief is the map that shows what was worth keeping, and then shows you where you might choose to go next. That evening, I booked the cruise. It felt both extravagant and wholly necessary. I called the travel agent Bernard recommended and gave her the dates. My hands trembled when I read the itinerary. Scans of faraway coasts, names of ports I had only seen in postcards. She asked about emergency contacts. I told her a name and a phone number to use in the case of extraordinary need. I did not tell her that the phone number was Bernard's office number. Some precautions are small and quiet, and they do not need to be shouted. I paid with the emergency account Frank had left. It hurt to touch that money. It had been meant for rainy days, for small disasters, for the time a furnace failed in January. But this trip felt like weather of a different kind. It was an investment in the kind of aliveness I had been missing for too long. When I told Michael and Patricia, soon, in the way one might reveal a surprise party, it was on a night when the house smelled of roast and the table was set for a crowd that wasn't a crowd anymore. I planted my words like seeds. "You know that brochure you've been talking about?" I began, pouring wine into a glass I had owned since Frank and I first moved in. "I booked it. I'm going." They went still, as if someone had set down a large glass in the center of the table. Relief evaporated from their faces like steam. "You're leaving?" Patricia asked, disbelief playing at the edge of her voice. "I am," I said, "for a while." Michael's jaw tightened. I could see him measuring the horizon for legal landmarks he could plant flags in. "When are you coming back?" he asked. "I'll come back when I want to," I replied.
That is when Michael's tone changed in a way I've heard before. It went from son to strategist. You can't just, he began, and then stopped. There were things he knew how to say because he had been practicing them secretly. He threatened, not with harsh words at first, but with the possibility of lawyers and filings. He said he could contest the sale. He said the POA had been in place and I had signed. He said the bank would listen to him. I told him calmly that Bernard was handling the legal side. I did not show the ripple of fear his words caused. Fear is a private business. It visits, it leaves, and sometimes it helps you pack. The cook of my sister-in-law's chicken simmered away on the stove. Outside, the night gathered itself like a velvet shawl. I finished my wine and felt the house like an armature holding my life. I had packed a small bag for the first leg of my voyage. A sweater, my passport, a photograph of Frank, and a notebook I intended to fill with places and faces. I had also prepared a set of documents. Dr. Chen's letter, copies of bank statements, the power of attorney documents we intended to challenge, and my list of contacts. These things were prudence. They were also a way of telling myself, you are not helpless. That night, I wrote to Michael. I told him I loved him, and I told him I would always be his mother. I told him I needed him to respect my choices. I didn't accuse him in the way the evidence might allow. I let the paper bear the harder words I didn't want to say in person. I told him that if he'd been worrying about the wrong thing. Worry about making sure I'm safe. My safety defined by my terms, not by the convenience of a sale. When I sealed the envelope, I felt lighter and more frightened than I had in a long time. Freedom and fear have similar pulses. Both ask you to step. Freedom asks you to walk forward. Fear hopes you'll stay. The next morning, the house felt like a stage. Susan called to say there was a cash offer.
The buyer wanted the house as is, and that phrase felt like both a comfort and a betrayal. As is meant to read like something tidy, but to me it meant my life, my things, my memories, boxed and forked into a ledger. We agreed on a closing date. Bernard prepared the letters to the bank. Dr. Chen placed a copy of her evaluation in my file at the bank. Doris came over and rearranged my spice cabinet because she said it would make packing easier. I began to speak of the future in the way old men speak of good weather in the afternoon, cautiously, gratefully. I practiced small new rituals. I walked to the park and sat on a bench and watched a boy teach a dog to fetch. I ate lunch at a diner where the waitress knew my name. I tried on the idea of being seen in the world as someone who had decided upon joy rather than a quiet resignation. But not all of it was light. In the quiet hours, a question nagged. How had this happened? How had the son I loved so much become a man who thought he could rearrange the last act of my life like a set decorator changing the lighting cue? The hurt was sharp and elemental. I had trusted him, and he had made choices that benefited him financially. That simple sentence is heavier than it sounds. There is betrayal, and then there is the complicated kind that wears love's clothes, that makes it harder to name and harder to cast out. Bernard reminded me that family betrayals are rarely straightforward. People are greedy for many reasons: fear, pressure, inheritance fantasies, the need to feel useful. He reminded me, clinically, that some people justify wrongs by folding them into the language of care. They'll say they were only trying to protect you, he said. That's a common framing. Then why not talk about it, I asked, maybe too sharply. He shrugged in the way lawyers sometimes do. Talking is fine when it solves the problem. When it won't, action is required. Action required cash, paperwork, and distance. It required courage measured not in fireworks, but in the slow accumulation of small, defiant choices. It required me being willing to let go of the easy path of being seen as the good mother who endured for her children. It required something else entirely, the refusal to be invisible. The night I mailed the acceptance for the buyer and the deposit for the cruise, I wrote one line in my notebook: choose yourself without burning bridges. The line read like a mantra. It felt like the thin cord between two cliffs. It was still a rope. I remember the day I packed the last of the dishes into a box and labeled it kitchen, keep. I remember touching the faded blue cup that had been Frank's and thinking, not for the first time, that memory isn't in things. It's in how you move through the day. I could take memory without also taking the burden of others' choices. Packing was both physical and ethical labor. I made the difficult decisions. I donated some of the furniture to the church.
I kept a few things. The painting Frank had painted during retirement, the quilt my mother made, the recipe cards with grease marks. Those items felt like anchors, like a map of who I was. On the morning of the staged compliance dinner, an evening where I'd say the words they'd hoped to hear, my hands were steady as I set the table. The act of performing acceptance felt like a small betrayal, but a necessary one. If the play was to go on, then I would choose the role, the lines, and the stage direction. They wanted me to say yes. I would say it on my terms, and then walk out the door with my map and my purse. When Michael arrived, he looked relieved. He asked about dates and paperwork and what they'd need to do. He leaned in as if to listen to my wishes. I spoke like a woman who's been practiced in diplomacy, saying exactly the things that would open the door, but not hand him the key. Maybe I should try the community for a few weeks, I said, tilting my chin with the practiced uncertainty of someone making an offer. See how I feel. They wanted me to be content. They wanted to be the ones to have been right about their worry. I let them feel that small victory. Inside, I had a suitcase half-packed and a legal team primed to move. I had a plan that felt like a secret and a small thrill. To leave, yes, but not to be taken. To travel, not to hide. That night, after the last dish had been washed and the kitchen light dimmed, Michael walked me to the door and kissed my cheek in a way that tried to erase old sins. "Please be safe, Mom," he said. "I will," I said, and meant it. The house was quiet as I slid into my bed. The world beyond my front window hummed with its small neighbors and their private lives. I thought of the sea brochure again, and the way its images had offered a kind of promise, not of forgetting, but of finding new ways to carry the past. I pictured myself on a balcony with a cup of coffee, and the horizon unrolling like a book I'd never read. It felt daring to want that. Early the next morning, before anyone else stirred, I walked through the house for the last time as a woman who intended to leave on her own terms. I opened drawers I'd never opened in months, pressed fingers to the spines of books, breathed in the scent of the house one more time. There was sorrow, yes, but also an oddly bright anticipation, like the moment before a great orchestral piece begins. I left a note on the kitchen table for Patricia and Michael, not an accusing letter, but a letter with clear lines. It told them the basics. The sale would proceed, I would be traveling for an extended period, and Bernard would handle any necessary correspondence. I put the note in an envelope and set it where they would find it. I didn't want drama, I wanted clarity. Then I drove to the bank, with the doctor's letter folded in my purse, and a small list of key items.
Bernard had suggested I be present when they received the documents to make sure the records showed that I was the one initiating many of the requests, not someone else operating in my stead. The teller recognized me and gave a polite smile. I handed over the doctor's note and the request for an accounting. The clerk typed and stamped, and then slid a printed ledger across the counter. The numbers were stark and raw. Transfers, dates, names. I felt a strange calm watching the facts line up like beads. I left the bank with evidence in my hands and a plan in my heart. The rest was timing, closing dates and cruise departures, the careful choreography of steps that would make it possible for me to leave with what I'd considered precious, my dignity, some money, and the possibility of a life that still had room for surprise. As I drove home, the leaves on the trees were a watercolor of late summer, and the road rolled under my tires like a ribbon. I felt both incredibly small and fiercely large. The house awaited me as if an old friend had no opinion of my choices. Inside, the couch held the shape of evenings, and the calendar held the space of days to come. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my notebook to begin a list. People to write, things to sell, items to donate, letters to place in files. Then my phone rang. The number flashed Michael's name. "How are you feeling?" he asked, voice careful. "I feel like I'm about to do something I should have done years ago," I said, and couldn't entirely keep the smile from my voice. There was a pause on the line, a small, private world held between us for a second, and then he said, "Just be careful, Mom. I just want you safe." "I know you do," I replied, "but safety and control are not the same thing." He didn't answer that. Maybe he knew it was true. Maybe he didn't. I folded my hands and looked at the brochure again, the ocean foam printed so bright it looked like a promise. In the kitchen's late light, my house felt both like a shelter and a trap. I had chosen. I would leave. But I also understood that choosing to go would begin another chapter I had not yet written. Arguments about closing dates, lawyers' letters, a son who might not be content to lose control without a fight. There were practicalities to tie up, and there were emotions to set like stones on a ledge. But for the first time in months, I felt that I was steering. The world was not merely something acted upon. It could be something acted into. I turned off the light and went to bed with the image of a ship on my mind, its hull steady, its bow cutting through water towards places I had only ever read about. I told myself I would take photographs, make friends, write letters. I promised to return as the woman I had chosen to be, not as the woman others had designed for me. In the quiet before sleep,
I thought about Frank's hand on my back in the old days, the way he had encouraged me to stand taller at the end of each winter. I thought about him and the way he laughed when I danced poorly in the kitchen. I thought of the last time he had said, "Make sure you look after yourself." I suppose, in a way, that's what I'm doing now, keeping his last instruction like a talisman. In the morning, I would sign the final stack of papers, hand the keys to the escrow, and iron a small flag of dignity into the collar of the everyday. The closing went through with a quietness that felt almost ceremonial. The papers slid across the table, and signatures found their places. Susan handed me a small keyless envelope containing the escrow check information, and for a moment I held nothing more substantial than a folded piece of paper and the knowledge that the house would no longer have my name on the mailbox. I drove away with the last box in the trunk and the quilt Frank's mother had made across my knees. The street seemed the same, and yet everything had shifted a shade. The buyer paid cash. The closing agent counted and signed and stamped. Bernard had done his work in the background, sending letters, leaning on the bank, and making sure every transfer out of my account was explained and, where necessary, reversed. He moved to limit Michael's access and to challenge the validity of certain signatures. I don't pretend those actions were easy or that the legal wheels moved with the speed of the righteous. Banks and the courts have their own rhythms, and sometimes you must be patient enough to let the conversations finish. But the combination of Dr. Chen's evaluation, the bank's ledger, and Bernard's persistence put weight behind the argument that someone had taken advantage of a moment of trust. On a gray morning that smelled like rain and possibility, Doris came by and sat with me as I put the last box into the car. She folded her hands like someone who was about to pray and then decided it wasn't necessary. "You're not running," she said plainly. "You are leaving to live." Her voice straightened my resolve. We drove to the airport together. I remember the light on the terminal glass, the way it gilded the edge of my new passport photo like a promise. I kissed Doris on the cheek and took a deep breath as if I were inhaling a first chapter. The ship loomed like a hotel that had learned to swim. People moved with the calm confidence of those who have decided, at last, to be curious. Life at sea has a strange economy of small delights. The air tastes different, salt with an undertone of something clean and decisive. On the first morning, I stood on the balcony with coffee cooling in my hands and watched the coastline recede. Land shrank like a photograph and then unfolded into 100 new angles in the space of my heart. I had taken a map out of a drawer and let it surprise me. The other passengers became a kind of family on the high seas. Helen, a retired schoolteacher from Michigan with a laugh like a bell. Robert, a widower who played chess on the deck and told stories in low, exacting sentences. Marie, a woman from Florida whose knitting needles clicked like metronomes and who offered me a friendship as if she'd been waiting for me at the gate. We formed what we jokingly called the Escape Committee, a group of people who had, for various reasons, chosen to be somewhere else for a while. We traded stories over buffet lunches and late-night glasses of port, and with each exchange I found myself inventing new corners of myself I hadn't known were closed. Ports of call became chapters. In Cartagena, I bought a small ceramic bird that reminded me of Frank's whistling. In the Canary Islands, I ate oranges so bright I thought my fingers would stain. In Lisbon, I learned to say hello and thank you in a rhythm that felt like an invitation to notice small courtesies. Each place was a kind of therapy, gentle dislocation that allowed me to see my own life from afar. The ocean does that. It gives you a view where you can read your past without being trapped by it. Of course, distance does not make problems disappear. At sea, the phone calls and emails still came. Michael's voice had a new edge when he called the first week I was gone, a mixture of fear and anger braided into words. "You shouldn't have sold the house without talking to us," he said, and there was a tremor I recognized as genuine worry. Then later, a sterner call. He wanted to challenge the sale. He talked of legalities and paperwork and the POA. Patricia left messages that veered between pleading and thinly veiled accusations. I read them on the ship's deck and felt a small earthquake of emotion. Betrayal layered over the grief of watching a child become something I didn't entirely recognize. Bernard, who became my line of defense and also the voice of sober counsel, did not sugarcoat the reality. A son might file suit. Institutions might be slow to act on restitution. Litigation could scar relationships into permanent unfamiliarity. He also did not counsel me to return on the basis of fear. "You have documented evidence," he said during one phone call across the Atlantic. Dr. Chen's letter, the bank's accounting, affidavits from people who saw how the transfers were made. Those things make a case. They don't guarantee a clean verdict, but they give you leverage. Leverage is a strange kind of power. It means you can negotiate when others come to the table. It means you can choose terms. It gave me the confidence to put a polite, honest letter in the mail to Michael stating my expectations, respect for my choices, a request for an accounting of how the money had been used, and an invitation to sit down with Bernard to speak, not fight. I wrote not from the height of accusation, but from a place that sought clarity. There is dignity in asking for explanation.
The letters got louder along the way. Michael's lawyer wrote a terse note. The bank, having been pushed by Bernard, began to reverse some suspicious transfers and opened an internal investigation. I received a formal notice that the POA would be contested. All of this felt like a strange chess match being played with lives as pieces. I tried to remember that legal maneuvers don't always look like the pictures in novels. They are often slow, procedural, and at times maddeningly mundane. But the momentum was with me. I had not resigned, I had chosen. The cruise itself continued to do its restorative work. There were nights on the deck with stars that made me feel both childlike and incredibly ancient. There were friendships that mended the small, ragged places worry had worn thin. Helen and I would sit and watch the wake and talk about the ridiculousness of television shows we'd both loved in other decades. Robert taught me how to recognize clouds as a sailor might, a talent that made my heart expand in a new way. Marie knitted me a scarf the color of a new beginning, and I wrapped it around my shoulders the night we crossed the equator. On the 72nd day of my trip, as the ship eased into a harbor I couldn't quite name without consulting a list, my phone buzzed with Bernard's message. There was an offer on the table from Michael's side. He was willing to settle for a sum instead of an extended court fight. The number, $25,000. The message gave the number with a surgeon's blandness. Bernard recommended considering it as a way to avoid years of public spectacle. He told me that such settlements are common, pragmatic choices, and that accepting one would not mean there had been no wrongdoing. It would simply close one door and allow us to open another. I sat on the balcony and let the port smells wind around me. I thought about the ledger Frank had kept, about the quilt in my lap, about the small joys of mornings where the news was not an anxious litany. I thought about what a court could cost: time, energy, the prying eyes of neighbors, the potential for relationships to calcify into bitterness. I also thought about principle. What does justice look like for someone who has been betrayed by family? What does peace feel like for someone who must live with the knowledge that a child took advantage of trust? In the end, I chose a middle way, the way Bernard had sketched out months earlier when he spoke of tempered action. I accepted the settlement. It was an awkward, imperfect sum, enough to cover losses and to send a signal that the behavior had consequences, not so punitive it would ruin a life or blow the family into irretrievable pieces. In exchange, Michael agreed to sign documents relinquishing any claim to accessing my accounts without my explicit permission, and to acknowledge in writing that certain transfers would be considered questionable. Bernard drafted the language with care and a small moral firmness that made me proud of him.
When we negotiated the final details, it felt like a strange, grown-up confession. Michael came to a small conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and resolution. He looked smaller in the bright light, a son who had been wrapped in his own fears and rationalizations. "I didn't mean to hurt you like this," he said, the words climbing out of him as if they were something he had rehearsed without believing. There was apology in his tone, messy and partial. I accepted what was given, an apology coupled with an agreement that included boundaries. I saw then that reconciliation would be gradual, and it would live under conditions that protected me. We agreed on the money. I did not want it as vengeance. I wanted it as restitution and as a shore against future erosion. The legal documents wound their way through signatures and notary stamps. Bernard closed another case folder and, as always, looked at me with the wry sympathy of someone who understands how family and law entangle. "You did well," he said, and I heard the compliment as both evaluation and benediction. When the settlement was complete, when my name was returned to some accounts and Michael's access appropriately limited, I felt a weight ease like a tight knot loosening. That there were other things that didn't dissolve with paperwork. Time would be the arbiter of trust. Michael and I would have to rebuild, step by careful step, with new boundaries and conversations that didn't pretend the past had not been painful. I took the last weeks of the cruise like vitamins. I let the world in without obligation. We sang on decks until our voices were hoarse. Helen and I took a class on painting landscapes, and I found that letting color splash onto canvas was a different kind of control, one that didn't involve ledgers or legalese, but that repaired a sense of seeing. Robert and I played chess and argued about openings with a seriousness that made young people blush. Marie taught me a new stitch pattern that, absurdly, became a metaphor for how to weave new life. simple loops repeated into something unexpectedly beautiful. When the ship finally eased back into the port of departure and land re-emerged with its slow and familiar facets, I felt more myself than I had in years. The trip hadn't erased the hurt. It had softened its edges and reminded me there was more to my story than the chapter where I was betrayed. I had friends who held slices of my life now, who'd seen me laugh and who'd understood my quiet moments. I had photographs and postcards and the smell of 1,000 nights spent under different stars. Returning to Ohio felt like stepping back into the same book, but on a new page. I bought a small condo not far from the lake in a neighborhood that felt lively in a gentle, honest way. The windows looked over water and the city at a distance. It was a place with less yard work and more possibility.
Susan helped me find it. A bright unit on the 3rd floor with enough light for plants and a balcony where I could sit and watch storms roll over the lake like dramatic performances. It was not the bungalow on Maple Street, and sometimes I missed the creak of its porch, but the condo felt like a chosen smaller stage, a place I had selected rather than been placed. The first night in the condo, I took out Frank's painting and hung it over the mantel. I spread out the recipe cards and put the blue cup on a shelf where light would find it. The quilt became my bedspread. I called Doris and told her about the view and the neighbors who baked and the woman across the hall who had a laugh like the jangle of bells. They came over with casseroles and the oddity of comfort and the banality of kindness, friends who had watched and then kept standing. Michael visited a few times after the settlement. He came with a box of pastries and an apology that had the spare honesty of someone learning a new language of care. We talked in the living room while the kettle boiled. We did not pretend the hurt had evaporated. We spoke of boundaries and money and the ways we had both failed and loved. He admitted he had been frightened of losing control, of aging, of the idea of being the child without answers. I listened. I spoke. We agreed on terms that seemed sensible. No access without consent, regular, transparent accounting of any assistance, and an agreement to speak with Bernard if either of us felt the boundaries were being tested. Reconciliation, I learned, is not an event. It is a practice. It requires daily choices to speak honestly and to let old stories change their shapes. Michael came to dinner on Sunday sometimes. Other weeks he did not. He called on birthdays. We took 2 steps forward and 1 back at times. He was tender and tentative and human. I forgave, but always with my own protection in place. Forgiveness does not mean erasure. People asked how I could leave the house where I'd lived with Frank for almost 5 decades. They asked if I missed it every day. The honest answer is yes and no. I missed the rhythms of the bungalow, the loose board by the back step, Frank's mug in the cabinet, the way the light hit the staircase in the late afternoon. But I didn't miss the feeling of being managed or planned for by others. I traded a particular sorrow for a broader sense of life. I traded a static shrine for a life that moved. Friends asked if I regretted the cruise, the sail, the choice to take control. My answer was straightforward. I had no regrets for choosing dignity. Not everyone can or should make the same choices. My situation was particular. There was a fund Frank had left. There was a lawyer who could navigate the mess. There were friends who could hold the fort. For others, the path will be different. My story is less a how-to than a reminder. If you find yourself diminished by the people who should be your caretakers, seek counsel, document what you can, and choose in a way that preserves yourself. There were small celebrations, a dinner where Bernard came and we toasted with sparkling cider, where Doris made a lemon pie so tart it made everyone's eyes water in the best way. There were quieter victories. The first morning I sat on the condo balcony with my coffee and did not feel the tug of fear. The first time I laughed without the memory of the whispering in the kitchen casting a shadow. There were the new friendships, the bridge club I joined, the volunteer work at the library, the Sunday walks with neighbors who had dogs and stories. Sometimes at night I take out my notebook and read the lists I made when packing, the things I wanted back, the things I wanted to keep. I cross off items and add new ones. I write notes to myself, short reminders that life can be both tender and stubborn. I write, choose joy, keep boundaries, write letters. I write, remember Frank's laughter. On certain afternoons when the sun lays itself sideways across the water and the gulls make their rough, honest noises, I think about the brochure that started it all. The glossy World Cruise brochure promised an endless horizon. What I gained was not an endless horizon,
but the capacity to choose which horizons I would see and when. The sea taught me how to hold the past without being trapped by it. If there is a lesson in all of this, maybe it's the simple one of stewardship, not of things, but of self. We have responsibility to others, yes. We also have responsibility to ourselves. There is agency in choosing a life that honors your years, your memories, and your dignity. You don't have to make enemies to protect yourself. You can set boundaries, ask for transparency, and insist on respect. You can also choose to love with eyes open. Sometimes people ask if I would have done anything differently. Perhaps I would have asked more questions sooner. Perhaps I would have been less trusting in certain moments. But hindsight is a polite companion. It brings insight without the cost of the lived pain that taught it. I try not to be harsh with the woman I was. She did what she knew with the tools she had. I am glad she kept her stubborn heart. These days I spend mornings walking along the lake, afternoons at the community center teaching a class on simple recipes that carry stories, and evenings with friends who have become my chosen family. Michael and I have settled into a pattern of honest, careful contact. We have yet to be whole, but we are present to each other in a new way. If you're watching this because you know someone who has been treated like an object rather than a person, if you feel the small, dull panic of accounts being rearranged or decisions being made without you, know that you are not alone. There are professionals who can help, and there are choices you can make that preserve your agency. I cannot promise a neat ending for everyone, but I can promise you this: choosing yourself is never shameful. It is an act of courage, and sometimes it is the only honest form of love. If this story matters to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear that dignity is worth protecting. And if you want to hear more stories of people who reclaimed their lives, subscribe and come back.